rate of advance from the first robot, which was called Big Dog, which is a very terrifying thing to watch, Big Dog.
And we don't even know what these things are, like the autonomous cars that are being developed. You know, people still think about those as cars, but that isn't what they are. They're autonomous self-learning robots. And the fact that they happen to take the form of cars at the moment is almost irrelevant.
After humans become completely dependent on AI, and we either merge or become a zoo, where can we find meaning?
Well, there's a lot of hypotheticals in that question. I don't really know how to answer that, because I don't think it's within the scope of anyone's vision to predict even what's likely to happen over the next 40 years, because the rate of technological advance is so insane that in some sense all bets are off. And I really mean that. You know, I have a variety of contacts in Silicon Valley, and there are people there that I've been communicating with who believe that it's already within their power to build an AI machine that will have higher computational capacity than the human brain. That's within 5 years. Now that assumes that they've got the computational capacity of the brain properly calculated, and that's not necessarily the case. But even if they're out by a factor of 10, that's not many iterations past that. Now maybe we don't understand the brain at all. That's certainly possible. But it isn't just the rapid increase in computational power that's doubling so quickly. I don't know if any of you, how many of you watch the Boston Dynamics videos? So, how many of you don't know what I'm talking about? Okay, so one of the things I would highly recommend is that you go home and go to YouTube and look up Boston Dynamics, because it's the most advanced robotics company in the world, and it was a DARPA project, so an American defense company, and they were bought by Google 5 years ago, and they had pretty damn impressive robots. They could make their way over rough terrain, including snow, up hills. If they slipped on the ice, they could right themselves. If you pushed them over, they could put themselves back up. And that's not joystick controlled. That was all autonomous. And they ran on gasoline-powered motors and were capable of autonomous action for an hour and a half or so. And I looked at the last iteration, and it's a small robot about this big, and it has a hand that looks like a head. And it's so sophisticated that it can gyrate to music spontaneously, and it can keep its head in the same place while it does it, like a chicken. And it can open doors, and it's quite the remarkable creature. And the rate of advance from the first robot, which was called Big Dog, which is a very terrifying thing to watch, Big Dog, to this is quite staggering, and that's only going to increase insanely, that ability over the next 5 years. And you know, there's something very strange about robots that people don't generally think about. Some people do. Imagine you have a robot and it can learn a few things through imitation, and we already have robots that can do that, because you can program a robot, industrial robot that's worth about $20,000. You can move its arm the way you want it to move its arm, and then it will move its arm that way. So imitation is coming up very rapidly, and the capacity to autonomously learn is already there to some degree. Let's say you have a robot that can learn a little bit, not much, but then let's say you have 20 million of them, and they're all exactly the same, and they have exactly the same architecture. And so what that means, as soon as one robot learns something, then all 20 million of them learn it. And so if each robot is learning one thing a day, then the whole herd is learning 20 million things a day. And so once we hit a certain threshold, the rate of increase in robotic intelligence is going to be just something that we can't even comprehend. I talked to the people at Tesla who ran the autonomous car division, and they know perfectly well they weren't creating autonomous cars, because an autonomous car isn't a car. It's a robot. And it's not just a robot, it's a fleet of robots, and it's a fleet of intelligent robots. And some of the functions that it will perform will be the functions of a car. But to think about that as a car is just, you're just confused. It's like to think of a car as a horseless carriage. The person who ran the division told me that they'd already had plans instantiated so that all the Tesla cars map the roads, and they're mapping them at an increasingly high level of resolution, and then they share the data. And they expected to get to the point where the car would be able to predict where the bumps on the road were that it was approaching and adjust the suspension so that when you hit the bump, you wouldn't feel that at all, because the suspension would have mapped the bump before it encountered it. And so, and that's just, it seems like a trivial example in some sense, but it's not trivial. It's an example of how unbelievably quickly this technology is progressing. So now, what are we going to do about that? Well, I'm hoping that we're going to be smart enough as individuals and careful enough and ethical enough and fast. And so I think that we have the opportunity, if we could shake our post-war apocalyptic pessimism, we have the opportunity to make the world a far better place. But with all that technological power comes the capacity for things to go seriously sideways. So we better be wise enough to master our technology. And again, I would say, well, that's all on you. You're all going to be participating in this intensely. And it's all going to depend more than you think on the decisions that each of you make. So you better make the right decisions, because you've got a lot more power than you think, and it's going to increase at a tremendous rate. So I don't see a better route forward than to make stronger people. So
they're always after the next new thing as fast as possible. So it's a machine that's speeding along as fast as a machine possibly can. And God only knows where it's headed in some sense, right? Because there's so many things happening at the same time that it's impossible to keep track. And we don't even know what these things are. The autonomous cars that are being developed, people still think about those as cars, but that isn't what they are. They're autonomous self-learning robots. And the fact that they happen to take the form of cars at the moment is almost irrelevant. They're no more cars than cars were horseless buggies, right? They're a whole new thing. And what's really interesting about robots like that is that they basically, they're all identical, right? More or less. Mm-hmm. And what that means is that when one learns something, every one of them learns it at the same time. And so even if they're not very bright, if there's 10 million of them, or 100 million of them, and they're all learning one thing a day, that's 100 million new things a day that every one of them is learning. And so they're mapping the road, and they're learning how to operate in a natural environment, which is a really big deal. Like, it's a really, really big deal. They're learning to map the perception of the world onto action, which is really the definition, a good definition in some sense of intelligence. And then everyone in Silicon Valley is rushing to produce artificially intelligent systems, which are being tried out in 50 different ways, 100 different ways now. And then they're also rushing to build more and more powerful computational devices as fast as they possibly can. And there's a huge arms race in that direction. And arms races, of course, well, they tend to progress perhaps exponentially. And so all these things are happening at the same time. Well, we have no idea what that means. We don't even know if we need to be worried about Facebook, because God only knows if it'll even exist in 5 years. It could even be the same with Google.